Okay, this is Dennis Speed, and I'm welcoming everybody to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche. This is a pre-discussion for the conference that we'll be holding in 9 days, which will be sponsored by the LaRouche Legacy Foundation. This is the grouping that we've assembled for the purpose of making available through print and other means all of the work of Lyndon LaRouche. And this is an ambitious project which will involve many years, a lot of research, and quite a bit of money because of the voluminous nature of what Lynn did. Now, we consider this project to be of particular urgency because of the kind of complex of crises that we've now seen erupt in the world. Multiple pandemics, the pandemic of usury in the form of a quadrillion dollars bubble, about 2 to 3 quadrillions of dollars. The pandemics that we see associated with the coronavirus, and then a sort of process of cultural meltdown that has visited the transatlantic world, which is similar to processes that happened in the 14th century. You'll hear a little bit more about that a little later from Lyndon LaRouche himself in an excerpt that we'll be playing in a bit for you. So I just want to give a sense of all of this and how we see this. So you have an increasingly complex web of processes into which the LaRouche faction has poised itself to intervene. And if you've seen our recent conferences, you know that. We're doing things around Afghanistan. We're doing things, obviously, around the issue of global warming and climate change. And we will be doing things soon around the impending shutdown of the national economy of the United States, the evictions that are coming, the mortgage question, and the possible meltdown of the monetary system as a whole. So there's a lot of things that we are called upon to do. But the issue is, how can people look at this from above and not think about following or pursuing one particular path? If you take something like, for example, our idea about our World Health Platform, you can't differentiate that from talking about, you can't talk about just vaccines with that. That's not what that's about. That's about sanitation, that's about clean water, and that's about massive deployment of energy. In fact, a complete overhaul of the energy capabilities, leading with nuclear fission and going to thermonuclear fusion. And so it's a completely different proposal than simply the intent to answer the immediate emergency that people happen to have concerned themselves with, which they refer to as a coronavirus pandemic. And yes, there is that, but there's something much more fundamental, which was discussed by us almost 50 years ago. And that is that there has been a degradation of the ecology of the planet caused by the monetary policies of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, not by coal, not by oil, not by fossil fuels, but by the monetary policies that were perpetrated on the globe, particularly on Africa, South America, and Asia, by the World Bank of Robert McNamara and by the International Monetary Fund. And that's why back in 1974, in 75, we authored a document which was the result of something called the Biological Holocaust Task Force. It was organized by us to say that if you allow these policies that were depopulation policies associated with Vietnam and so on, if you allow that to happen, you would degrade the very ecology of the planet by those policies, not by the use of fossil fuels, and not by warming or cooling the planet. And so this is the process that we actually see underway. It is not merely coronavirus. We're talking about a couple dozen non-treatable bacteria and fungi that are running around the planet right now, and have been infecting American hospitals at least since 2015, 2016. So this is a complex set of processes. So the issue is, what can we do? What's the method by which we can approach this? It's important to note that people like the present Chancellor of Austria are saying things like, it would be totally wrong to believe that we can save the planet by asceticism. The only right approach is to rely on innovation and technology. I do not share at all the view that our direction should be going back to the Stone Age. That's significant, not because merely of this individual, but because there is a definite faction in the transatlantic world that is capable of being mobilized to that end. But it is not the financial oligarchy. Now, important to understand here, financial oligarchy is completely capable of wiping out the human race, and itself included, in the exercise of its infinite wisdom. This happened, or nearly happened. It certainly had happened in Europe in the period of the late 13th and early 14th century. I mentioned a couple of days ago some of our associates that the city of Florence, Italy, famous for the Brunelleschi Dome, famous for Leonardo da Vinci, Niccolo Machiavelli, Brunelleschi, Nicola Cusa, many people, Toscanelli, the city of geniuses. That city was depopulated not by the bubonic plague, which hit it about 1347, but was depopulated because of the financial policies, the looting policies, the Wall Street-like, City of London-like policies of the financial oligarchy of the time. They were associated with something called the Guelph family or Guelph party, and other portions in the particular banking houses. The city went from a population of 105,000 to 125,000 in the year 1300, down to 80,000 before the Black Plague, before the bubonic plague hit. And then what happened was the plague cut it into half, went from 80 to 40, and rather quickly. They sort of peaked about 1351, but it never got back to the level of over 100,000 until about the year 1700. So there was a period, from the standpoint of population density at least, that from 1300 all the way until 400 years later, you never even got back to the level that you had achieved. Similar things happen in different parts of the world at different times, but this is the important one to note in this case. For example, in present-day Iraq, there had been something like that in the 8th century, where that area had about 30 million people, and it didn't get back to that level until, relatively recently, the last 100 years. So it's been the case before that people have been that screwball that they have created the preconditions, and that's the actual preconditions or the underlying conditions that you're looking at right now in the United States or in Europe around the coronavirus. People talk about pre-existing health conditions. No, the pre-existing condition was the financial condition, what was called the Wall Street recovery, what's called the Dow at 30,000. Okay? That's the plague that actually has created the physical conditions all around you that make it extraordinarily difficult for the United States population or others to survive what is presently upon it. That's why you have 600,000 people dead, actually. It's not merely, in other words, coronavirus. It's these preconditions. And these preconditions are something that Lyndon LaRouche's economics uniquely went after. Now, it's important to try, therefore, to look at what went axiomatically wrong, what's fundamentally wrong in the thinking of people in the transatlantic sector. So to do that, what we're going to do is take a look, sort of the way that the poet Dante Alighieri, I mentioned 1300 in Florence. Well, there was a very famous poet, Dante Alighieri, and he was political. He was a member of the city council for a while there in Florence, and he was exiled in 1302 along with his political faction, and that began the process of decline. He wrote a great poem, and he, in writing that poem, created the Italian language. He did this because he realized that there was no possible way that the leadership of what you might have called Italy, but Italy really didn't exist. It was all a lot of different cities there's Venice, and there's Rome, and there's Florence, and there's Siena, and a lot of other cities. They were all individual states. And he realized that there was a fundamental flaw among all these people, and he had to try to correct it. So he wrote this poem called the Commedia, or the Divine Comedy, later it was called. And what he does is he describes the entire landscape of the time from the standpoint of the metaphor of hell, purgatory, and paradise. We need to take that kind of standpoint to look at our time, because you have the paradise outlook that you see in what we're doing, for example, in our space exploration to Mars or Moon or other things. But then you have the infernal side that you see, not merely with respect to the coronavirus, but look at the culture of New York City, between the sex clubs, the legalized drugs, and just the sort of decadence that you see just out there, including in the forms of entertainment. So it's necessary to take a look at this and try to figure out what's the systematic flaw. We're going to say that the systematic flaw has to do with this idea that computers and computation represents the apex of intelligence. This is one of these things that I think everybody's clear about. Computer models of climate change, computerized warfare in the case of drone warfare or cyber warfare, computerized elections, which of course is completely evil, the economy being driven by computerized trading, opinion polls that tell you whether or not supposedly everybody that you never meet is for or against something that you never got called about, statistical studies, intelligence tests, all this stuff is stuff that became popularized, largely anyway, after the Second World War. And it's basically destroyed the ability of Americans and people otherwise in the rest of the transatlantic world to think. The person who pioneered a lot of this is a person by the name of Norbert Weener, Wiener. We look at Weener, like Oscar Mayer Wieners. And he wrote a book called The Human Use of Human Beings, Cybernetics and Society. Now, Lyndon LaRouche, when he was about 27 years old, got hold of this book. Lynn was in the Second World War, came out in about 1945, 46, 47, that area. He became a consultant. He worked for a while at a consulting. His father was also involved in the shoe industry. He did that for a couple of years. Then he went into working in a jet engines production plant in 1949. He was there for about 3 years. And then did some other consulting work for other companies after that. He settled in New York City in 1952. And during 1948, he got hold of a copy of this book. And he got it because a friend of his was going to Boston University, and the friend was a son of the daughter of the author, Norbert Wiener. So Lynn got hold of the first book, which was called Cybernetics, and then he got hold of the second one called The Human Use of Human Beings. So what happened is this. Lynn says that he got very angry about this idea, which was that computers basically are capable of replacing human intelligence. And things you've all heard, and we don't have to go through, but I want to go through what he decided to do about it and what his studies led him to see. He wrote about this in his autobiography. And basically, he began a study in that year of 1948, which took him through 1952. And what he tried to do is to demonstrate that the process that's characteristic of life is not reducible to non-life. Later on, after he formed the organization, Lynn used, in particular, an example which you've heard from us if you've been around for a while, and if you haven't, let me say what this is. He used the geometric proof that Plato introduces in the Timaeus dialogue that came to Plato from Egypt. It came to Plato from an associate of his from the Cyrenaic Temple of Ammon in Egypt. And it has to do with this idea that there are 5 solids, the square or the cube, I should say, the tetrahedron or the pyramid, the dodecahedron, the octahedron, which is sort of a double pyramid, sort of upside-down pyramid connected, the octahedron, and the icosahedron, five different geometric shapes. And these are the only shapes that you can create in three-dimensional space that are regular-sided. So in other words, like if you think about turning a cube, any way you turn a cube, it's going to look square. Anywhere you turn a pyramid, you'll see a triangle, and so forth and so on. So all of the faces are regular in these solids. And the thing that characterizes this, however, is the ratios by which these are built. And what Lynn says about this, he says the construction of these so-called Platonic solids depends upon the construction of the circle's golden section. Now, why the circle? Well, because the idea is that all of these solid figures, three-dimensional figures, are containable within a sphere. And the sphere is considered, is the boundary condition for all of them. So the idea is that this is a particular harmonic principle, which is the principle of how things grow, how plants grow, for example, flowers grow, how the human body itself grows, and so on. And you see it replicated in different places in living beings. Now, what's interesting is that what happened was Leonardo da Vinci, in particular, investigated this, and there are studies about this that are significant. But I'm going to read to you something from a book which was done. It's called Leonardo da Vinci's Machines, and what it basically says is that what Leonardo was doing, because he was very interested in this proportion called the golden section, the life, the principle of life. And he says his cosmological research through mechanical intuition and technological projection caused him to see these things as one. That is to say, what he experienced in life and what he saw in mechanics. So this is a quote from Leonardo. There's actually 2 of them. And he's describing, he says this, Leonardo this is, the earth has a spirit of growth. The flesh is the ground. The bones are the stratifications of rocks which form the mountains. The blood is the spring water. There's a second quote which is next to a picture that Leonardo does of the anatomy of the neck. Basically shows all the neck muscles and shows the different limbs, the different parts of the neck. And he says this. He makes it almost look like there are musical strings inside of the neck. And he says, "O observer of this machine of ours, be not saddened by the fact that you make it known by means of the death of another," meaning he had to do anatomical studies, which at the time were considered by the church to be sacrilegious. But he was doing them, this was being done in secret. So he says, "Be not saddened by the fact that you make this known by means of the death of another, but instead take joy that our Creator has turned his intellect toward the excellence of such an instrument." And so what the authors are saying here and are trying to show, and they have a bunch of pictures of different illustrations that Leonardo did that are in his notebooks, that his construction of machines and his looking at the human body, including, for example, a drawing he has of an infant inside of an embryo, which is a drawing he did from life, that this makes it look, as they say, as though it's like a flower opening up, and that you're seeing the embryo within it as though it's a seed. And that these were, so that what Leonardo wanted to identify was, how do things grow? What is the principle of life? So Lynn says the following about this. He talks about Leonardo's friend, Luca Pacioli, who was a geometer. And Lynn says, that Luca Pacioli reconstructed the proof that Plato had experienced from the Temple of Ammon, that only the 5 Platonic solids are constructible regular solids in Euclidean space, or three-dimensional space, if we think about it. Says the work by Pacioli played a central role in the collaboration between him and Da Vinci. So here's the thing that they were looking at. And Lynn puts it like this. He said, if you don't take the case of astrophysics, in other words, planetary exploration, for example, or microphysics, investigation of, for example, viruses and bacteria, he said, if you don't take those two cases, he said that if you look at the processes of life, you'll see that if a process is harmonically congruent with the golden section, then that process is either a living organism or a special kind of work done by a living organism. So what Lynn was looking at is, okay, so if this is the case that we see this recurring proportion in human life, for example, there's no such thing as 6-inch tall people, nor are there 40-foot tall people. The human being is within a certain range, and that range may be relatively large, but it will not go beyond that and will not go below that or above that. And when, in fact, you have people who are 7 foot tall or people who are 5 feet tall, the body itself of those people is in proportion within its own, self. Okay? So it's not disproportionate. And when there's disproportion, we say it's ugly. We say it's misformed. And that's the reason we say that, because there's obviously a principle of growth, which is harmonic, and that's what makes things beautiful or ugly. So now, Lynn says the following, and this becomes critical to understanding his economics. He says, talking about the successor of Leonardo da Vinci, Johannes Kepler, who was a great astronomer, and if we talk about Kepler's 3 laws of gravitation. He says that Kepler's work operated from this idea. Since God is a living being, God's work must be harmonically congruent with the golden section, and that Kepler's entire work in astronomy is based on this. Sometime in the 1990s, Lynn enlisted, actually even a little bit earlier, a physicist by the name of Dan Wells. And they were having a conversation, and it had become an argument. And it was basically about whether Kepler, as an astronomer, was not merely superior to Newton, but whether or not Isaac Newton's astronomy was right at all. And Lynn had contended, as he does, that Newtonian mechanics is completely wrong, that it is absurd. And basically, Wells was arguing that this wasn't the case. And Lynn had offered the following hypothesis. He said, if you look at the orbits of the planets, that Kepler used this idea of the Platonic solids and the living proportion of the Platonic solids. And he said, that's how you'll find how the orbits of the planets are distributed. So Wells said, I don't know, So Lynn basically challenged Wells, or Wells took up the challenge to see whether this was true. And what he did was he demonstrated that, in fact, that were so. That even though Kepler didn't know about all of the planets, he had, in fact, properly identified the ratios of the planetary orbits for the planets that he knew of, and he used the 5 Platonic solids to do this. So the issue here is, how could he know it if he was never on a planet? And for that matter, how could he know it about planets that he didn't know, that he had never seen? This is the issue of economic forecasting. How is it possible to anticipate processes that one cannot experience, one cannot see? Because this is something that Lyndon LaRouche did in a series of forecasts, including the forecast of August that came true on August 15, 1971. Now, to be clear about what I'm saying about this and about Lynn himself, we are not saying that the particular thing that Nixon did that day, Lynn had said was going to happen that day in that way. He did not do that. What he did was he talked about the idea that the system that had been constructed from the Second World War required a form of productive investment physical changes, physical advancements that had to happen so that certain ratio of profit. This is not money, by the way. It has nothing to do with money, but physical investment in nature and physical investment in the human being, which would increase the skill levels and consequently the ability for the human being to be creative. That these investments had to be made at an accelerating rate in both the American population or any other population so considered, and that this had not been done. Instead, people were being looted, and you were using monetary values and various forms of usury and speculation to chisel on these physical investments. That this process had already begun by the late 50s in the United States, and that it accelerated after that. Lynn also stated that by 1966, the United States had reached the peak of its actual physical economic growth, and it began to first stagnate and then go in the opposite direction. So at the point that he started the organization, which was 1966, he began to pull people together, kind of almost like Noah's Ark style, to try to actually get a change in policy, or at least assemble persons that could fight against that trend, were he unsuccessful in changing it. And so when he began assembling the organization in the 68, 69 period, particularly at Columbia University or NYU or some of the other places, by that time that he did that, this process of devolution had already begun, and it was sort of expressed in a very specific way in Earth Day in April, I think it was April 20th, I believe, 1970, when you had all these people who started talking about how there are too many people in the world and the man is polluting the world, and what's got to be done is to get away from the machines, shut down the machines, and we've got to go in the direction that nature demands. What is that direction? So here I want to quote Norbert Weener, so that you have an idea why Lynn was so angry and what he had to say, and then return to a couple of other things about Lynn himself. We have a video, an audio, which I want to play. So this is from Norbert Weener. He says, this is from The Human Use of Human Beings. This is all a quote. Two quotes, actually. Here's the first one. There are local and temporary islands of decreasing entropy, which means growth. Decreasing entropy means increasing growth. Decreasing entropy in a world in which the entropy as a whole tends to increase, and the existence of these islands enables some of us to assert the existence of progress. We ourselves constitute such an island of decreasing entropy. It may very well be that life is a rare phenomenon in the universe, confined perhaps to the solar system or even to the Earth alone. The second quote, it is quite conceivable that life belongs to a limited stretch of time, and that the time may well come when the Earth is again a lifeless, burnt out, or frozen planet. It is a foregone conclusion that the lucky accident which permits the continuation of life in any form on this earth, even without restricting life to something like human life, is bound to come to a complete and disastrous end. In a very real sense, we are shipwrecked passengers on a doomed planet. We shall go down, but let it be in a manner to which we may look forward as worthy of our dignity. So basically what this guy is saying is that death with dignity is like the natural fate of human beings and of the universe, of all life. Well, that would make you pretty angry, I would hope, and it certainly made Lynn pretty angry. Lynn put this, however, statement of Norbert Weener in a very specific context, because he saw him as a degenerate form of something which was much older. So what we're going to now do is play Lynn, and this is Lynn from December of 1985. What he's doing is he's describing the condition of the of progress of Florentine civilization, particularly, and then how the United States was taken over by 1870. Lynn is saying 1870, and never after that had become independent, had been independent again until up to our own time. So if we can just play that audio.
That great upsurge called European civilization, erupting out of the Golden Renaissance, reaching a zenith in the American Revolution and the short-lived German liberation wars. That impulse, partly crushed by Henry Kissinger's ancestors at the Treaty of Vienna, Congress of Vienna, crushed by Capodistria, Venice, by Nesselrode, who should have been turned into a pie earlier, by Castlereagh and by Metternich. This oligarchical conception of society, certified by the Treaty of Vienna, born out of the bowels of the whore of Babylon, literally, the Chaldean form of society, the form of society of that abomination, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that abomination, the Ottoman Empire, that abomination, the Russian Empire, and sundry Oriental empires of similar description. That abomination, directed specifically against what were called the ideas of 1789, against the American Revolution, the idea of a democratic constitutional republic under law, governed by reason, which Henry Kissinger has avowed himself to destroy, and has done a good deal considering his limitations to do just that. In about the 1870s, that great upsurge, arrested but not defeated by the 1815 Treaty of Vienna, was unleashed in what can be called the first of a series of downward cultural paradigm shifts leading to our present condition of imminent disaster, a disaster comparable to but exceeding the disaster which struck Europe in the form of the so-called New Dark Age, from the death of Friedrich Hohenstaufen in AD to the culmination of the peaking of the Black Death in Europe in 1351 AD. We are now, and have been for 100 years, in a period precisely comparable to that. Don't blame particular policies. The politicians don't know what their policies are. They just know they've been told to push them. The people who invent the policies, except on the very highest level among the Benedictines, don't even know how the policies are made and concocted. You have to go to Venice, to the island of St. George Major, or the Montserrat Abbey in Spain if you want to see devilishness in South America, to understand who makes the policies and how. Or if you can stand the smell, to Mount Athos in Greece, which is the master of this sort of thing. But for 100 years, civilization has been sliding toward hell in a paradigm shift, and the people who have been involved day to day in engineering the policies leading to that downslide, most cases don't even know. They just think they're doing what's right because their unconscious impulses tell them that's the right that's the way right people behave. What happened essentially in the 1870s was that the United States was destroyed as a sovereign republic. The United States in the 1860s, in the course of the Civil War, had emerged as the most powerful economy and greatest military force on this planet. This transformation had been accomplished not by the means of war, which are inherently destructive. They had been accomplished by the form of mobilization of our republic by Lincoln, who himself was a profound thinker, contrary to the school books of today, and who was guided by the principles of republicanism in the deepest and purest sense, who organized a mobilization of industry, agriculture, and institutions, and infrastructure building to transform this nation and its potentialities into the most powerful economy and military capability on the face of this planet. Within 10 years, that power had been destroyed, and the sovereignty of the United States, in the truest sense, had ceased to exist. The means by which this was accomplished, which had worldwide implications and made possible every other kind of deviltry which has plagued the world in any part since, was the enactment of the predecessor of the Graham-Rudman Bill, the U.S. Specie Resumption Act of the 1870s. The act was conceived by a Congress as corrupt, or not quite as corrupt, as the present Congress, a Congress bought and controlled by the British and Swiss, a Congress governed by treason, which set out, as the authors of Graham-Rudman did, to destroy the United States. And they should have been hung as traitors, and the world wouldn't be in the mess that it's in today.
Okay, so that is Lynn's actual view. He never really changed that view. There is the partial exception of Franklin Roosevelt, because what happened was that the world then entered into a process of the self-cannibalization of the economies of Europe, which, is culminate, that various of the Berlin conferences, for example, of the 1880s and 1890s. And we saw that with what people call the First World War, which had no good side. It was a simple self-cannibalization of the societies of that time. It was launched by Edward VII of England, and then it was followed by the Second World War, which really there was, as Keynes said, simply an armistice of 20 years. And Keynes said it in 1919. In 1939, the next war, 20 years later, began. The Hitler process in that war killed 100 million people or more. And Franklin Roosevelt's United States was able to mobilize the productive power of the United States that Lincoln had bequeathed to the United States, and successfully, through the mobilization of that productive power, stopped the full-scale extermination of civilization. But Roosevelt died at the end of that process. His process of Reconstruction was never implemented, and the one thing that in part got done was what's called Bretton Woods. But rather than try to now give more of a history, let's talk for a minute about the moment we're presently in. So you have the Biden administration drunkenly asserting that the United States is leading the world in vaccine mobilizations, for example. But that's not true. First of all, China is doing more on that than any other location. But and just as pathetically, the European Union, which promised it was going to be doing all these things on vaccines, 200 million vaccines are going to be produced. They produced 8 million. Now, I'm not talking here about the issue of vaccines. I'm talking about the problem that these areas are no longer productive. You have a situation where Europe floods, Austria floods, Holland floods, Germany floods. And people say it's due to climate change, as opposed to admitting that it's flooding because you took down flood control or you never built flood control that you knew perfectly well how to build. People have been building flood control in Holland for hundreds of years. They, in fact, build their flood walls in anticipation of a kind of flood event that will happen only every 500 years. Because you've got to build with that in mind. And that's something that they've been doing for a long time. But no, now today, that's because of climate change. In other words, a religious view is imposed because it can, because you've reached the point of that kind of dark age. But you see, on the other hand, powers, some countries deciding they're going to walk away from that. India, for example, this week made the decision and made it clear that they're going to walk away from the Glasgow Global Warming Conference, COP26. Now, that may change, but right now, this is supposed to be a conference in which coal production is completely killed. But you can't do that because in the case of the Indian economy, or let's say Africa, if you do that, then you're going to immediately exterminate whole sections in the millions of the population, and you're also declaring you're going to do this in the middle of an acknowledged pandemic. So this isn't going to be, this isn't something that the various countries who are the true target of all of this can afford to do. The apology for trying to impose this on India or the 54 countries of the continent of Africa or parts of Asia is, well, we all must save the planet. See, you can't even do flood control, but you're going to save the planet. So when you hear that and when you see that, you realize you're dealing with something which is satanic. But then the question is, what can we do to mobilize, to marshal our forces together with forces in the world which are presently located in several places? China is one of the leaders of this because of its rejection of its own several failed policies, from particularly after of course, you had the colonial policies that were imposed on China, which was at one point occupied by 8 different nations. But then you have the policies post-World War II of the Great Leap Forward, in which about 25 million people died, of the Cultural Revolution, in which perhaps as many as 30 million people died. Nobody quite exactly knows. And, of course, then problems of flooding and other things, natural disasters that they've also had to deal with. And so they've rejected that. And they represent, largely because of the adoption in their own way of policies originating with this organization and Lyndon LaRouche personally, they adopted a pathway forward which was non-disastrous, not based on computers, not based on money, not based on speculation, but based on the idea of real physical production. So in conclusion, what I want to do is simply reference something and then play the final section from Lynn. Next week, and actually for our show next week also, we'll be talking about this. I'll be joined by Joel DeJean, among others, for that. There's going to, on the 9th and the 10th, 5 days from now, 4 days from now, 2 spacecraft, one called the Solar Orbiter, the other called Bepi Colombo. That's one that's intended to go to Mercury. They're going to both fly by Venus within 33 hours of each other. And one project is done by NASA with the European Space Agency. That's the Solar Orbiter. And that one is intended to orbit the sun and actually do some investigation of the poles of the sun, which has never happened before. And then the Bepi Colombo is going to do flybys of Venus. Now, these are complex projects which actually will evolve over the period of the next, 8-9 years. In the case of the Solar Orbiter, it's going to visit the sun in 2025, 2027, 2028, and 2029. And I believe it started, I think, with 2019, 2020. And so these are long-term things. You have to plan for this, but you have to think about the fact that everything that's going to evolve has been planned for the future. And really, this is, again, the issue of forecasting that I want to sort of conclude with. The notion here, which we called this, is the LaRouche method of forecasting, rejecting destiny by changing the future. We're going to play for you a forecast that Lynn made back in 1978. He was talking about the next 50 years, which would be through 2028. what you're going to hear him talk about did not happen. And it didn't happen because his presidential bid, and he's talking here, the first time he had declared he was going to run for the Democratic Party nomination for president. This is July of 1978. The audio is a bit damaged, so some words you're not going to be able to make out. So I'm going to just tell you a couple of things he's going to be talking about. The first is nuplexes, or nuclear complexes. And this is an idea of having kind of industrial centers focused around nuclear power plants. And these are a combination of cities. They're a combination of different kinds of plants. He will describe much of this. And you won't hear the word nuplex exactly clearly, but that's what he's saying, nuclear complex or nuplex. And he says a couple of things also about, but you'll get the spirit of what he's saying. It's about 4 minutes. And the first thing he says is that you start by building a giant crater. He was saying this to freak out any of the environmentalists in the room, and there were some in particular. And he talks about how you build a city. And then he talks about the idea that the United States and its allies are going to stop exporting products, and they're going to go to something way more human than that, and that's exporting whole cities. So we'll play you this and then draw our conclusion, and then we'll go to questions if we have those. So if we can hear the next audio.
What are we going to do? We're going to build nuplexes. We lay it out to us. How do you build a nuplex? Well, you go out and you dig a big crater. You lay a big footing, unless you've got bedrock, which even that off. You don't even care what the terrain is like. Makes no difference. Wherever you are, blast it out, build a crater. Build a crater covering an area the size of a city of 500,000 people or 100,000 people. But build a crater for an industrial city of a new type on an area of that size. All right, 6, 7, 8 stories below the surface. Build it up. Build up to the surface. On this thing, stick 2 nuclear plants, 0.5 gigawatt to 2 gigawatts each. You get a balanced load. String industries around this, using this energy to cut low distribution costs, like charm bracelets. Well, let's put a chemical industry here, that's the good thing. Let's have desalination here, so forth. Using the waste heat and the electrical power. Build housing for the families, modern housing to last 100 years. For the families of the people who are going to be brought in to do the construction, which will be done, completed within a period of 4 to 6 years. Build the on-site cultural program, schools, universities, technical schools, everything that a city requires. And when the project is completed, at the end of 6 years, these people occupy the factories because they've been educated. And gradually the Europeans and others who have been phased in phase out, except for a few key technicians. The city then is built, it's modular, you can change it, you can develop it with no big cost. Its transportation systems are built in and modular for the next 100 years for any technological improvements which will be significant in the next 100 years. The city functions. City buildings. Now, 4 to 6 years. We're going to build hundreds of these in the next 25 years. Hundreds of them. Hundreds of new cities throughout the world, especially in the developing sector. These cities will be linked together. They will form a network of high technology culture, planted in the middle of the rest of the population. And from these cities and through these cities and their universities and technical schools and technical services to the surrounding area, we'll lift one generation of the human race up from barbarism and oppression into modern life. And in the next 25 years following that, we'll complete the job. And within 50 years from now, the human race will be transformed as we city builders intend to do it. We're going to mobilize every industry that exists that's viable and every one that can be created to do this. We're not going to export a few $10, $20 billion worth of additional exports. We're going to export hundreds of cities. We're going to change the world in 50 years entirely. And we're going to lay the foundation for changing the world in 25 years. Our export program is going to rise to the trillions. And there's nothing speculative about it, it's just a hard business deal. That's all. Put me in the White House. Get a bunch of these characters down, American corporate power, European corporations. Get them down there and I tell them what we want to do. And they say, what about the details? I said, don't bother me about that. I know how to build something. You guys do it. Make it work. Remember, it's going to be built in 4 to 6 years this way, and there's not going to be a delay. You're going to get the job done. Now we're going to go out and negotiate. You are committed to doing it. Now we're going to go out and negotiate. We're going to deliver. We're going to give these things.
So that is actually why the LaRouche presidential campaigns were opposed and ultimately, of course, crushed in the short term. But truth crushed to the earth rises again. And the circumstances we now find ourselves in which none of that occurred, and we now face a form of disaster that has not been seen in approximately 680 years on the planet, provides a circumstance under which that vision can now be realized. So I'll just stop there, and we'll open it up. I'll open up the queue for whatever questions or discussion, and I guess I can make a couple of announcements. Okay, so it's open, and I'll just say that what we're looking for is that in the event of August 14th, there'll be 2 panels. Dennis Small and Megan Beats will be the moderators of those panels. We will have a lot of excerpts of Lynn's material and various, you could call it testimonial, I suppose, but you can, comments about Lynn, observations about Lynn, both from some of the people that have worked with, that had a chance to work with him, some of them deceased, of course, and otherwise, around. But I just wanted to say that much. And so more details on that, and maybe I've probably forgotten some. I'll try to make sure that before we conclude the call, I'm more specific. I think we're starting it. I actually don't know. Somebody should actually just write me a text message, somebody or someone in the area. Just call in and give the details on this. That would be helpful. We have people in the queue, so I'm going to go to the queue right now and begin to take a few questions or comments.